Now welcome to another lightning response video, where this time we got a question from Crossfire who asked, "Hey Thor, I need you to be blunt here. Forget the Star Wars bias and the benefit of the doubt. How much of Disney's Star Wars would you actually recommend? For the sake of the question, pretend everything they released isn't Star Wars and that it's just a generic sci-fi franchise." And there's actually something kind of ironic about this question, or perhaps I should say about the answer I'm about to give, because there is good Star Wars from Disney that I would absolutely recommend, those being, and I'll be sticking to the more mainstream stuff for the movies and the live action shows, not any animated or books or comics or anything like that. But the stuff that I would recommend to the average person, let's say, the stuff that just is good, completely independent of it being Star Wars or not, are things like Rogue One, the first season of The Mandalorian, and probably the second one as well, and now, so far anyway, Skeleton Crew. Those are the things I would recommend to just about anyone. Which isn't to say everything I didn't just mention is terrible. They are all, shall we say, varying degrees of not the greatest thing ever, or not something I'd necessarily recommend to just about anyone. And yes, some of them are pretty bad, don't get me wrong. Either way, getting to the ironic part now, all the things I mentioned have two main things in common. The first being they are primarily made up of brand new characters, or the stars of the show or movie are all brand new characters. There are certainly appearances from well-known or legacy characters in some of them, like Darth Vader in Rogue One, for example, or the many cameos in Season 2 of The Mandalorian. The second thing they all have in common is they don't really deal with, again, primarily, with what I would call the core of Star Wars, or what makes Star Wars kind of what it is, the unique parts that separate it from every other piece of sci-fi out there, or science fantasy, that being the Force and or Jedi and Sith and everything pretty much relating to them. All the best shows and movies, in my opinion, you can feel differently, you could have a different list, that's fine. But all the best shows and movies don't really have anything to do with the core of Star Wars, with the Force stuff, shall we say. In fact, a couple of them, like Andor, and for the most part Skeleton Crew thus far, they could almost have Star Wars removed from them entirely and still be good completely on their own, if not excellent in the case of Andor. Which isn't to say they don't feel like Star Wars, both do feel like Star Wars in their own way or to varying degrees. That's also not to say that the fact that they are Star Wars is somehow irrelevant or that it doesn't matter. For me, the fact that they are Star Wars, that they do use things from that universe or are being told in that universe about aspects of it, it makes them even better in a way. I appreciate the connections they have to the lore, even if, again, the lore they are using has little or nothing to do with the Force and or that Jedi Sith stuff. Especially Andor, which almost seems like it goes out of its way to have nothing to do with any of that. Put a different way here, you could say Disney, or Lucasfilm under them, they haven't made much in the way of really good, more, let's call it, traditional feeling Star Wars, Jedi versus Sith type stuff again. Or any at all, really, nothing that I personally would consider really, really good. Which, sure, that could be to some degree because I tend to be a bit more picky about Star Wars when it does deal with that sort of thing, with the Force, because again, that is the core of the whole thing, and if you get that wrong, you do a disservice to the rest of it, and it also just doesn't feel like Star Wars if you get the Force wrong. But anyway, Disney, or again, Lucasfilm under them, they have made good shows and movies set in the Star Wars galaxy, stuff that I would say, going back to the question, is actually good all on its own, and something I'd recommend it. Not because it's Star Wars or good Star Wars, but because it's actually just good all on its own. And yes, there can be things that are good just because they're Star Wars, meaning something that is, I don't want to say bad on its own or independent of Star Wars. In all reality, all Star Wars should be good Star Wars and also good on its own, or that is the optimal result of something they would create, something Lucasfilm would create. That it'd be something that fans can love because it rewards them for being fans, but also can bring in outsiders and new people into the fandom. But I certainly think it's okay to make something that is good for Star Wars, but that doesn't necessarily or automatically appeal to or resonate with people outside of the fandom, to the average person, shall we say. I really do think there are some fine lines here when it comes to being just good, even if it wasn't Star Wars or if you took it away from Star Wars, and being good for Star Wars. And of course, there's the question of, If it is good all on its own, if you can just remove the Star Wars and it's still great, is it really Star Wars? Shouldn't there be something about it that makes it good for Star Wars as well, if that makes sense? Either way, all of this goes along with something similar that I've talked about before, that being that, again, here in the Disney era, and from my point of view, Lucasfilm tends to always get wrong the things they really, really need to get right. They get wrong the stuff that fans tend to really care about the most. Things like the sequel trilogy, which deals with not only legacy characters, but the legacy characters, you could argue. The original trilogy characters, which are the reason Star Wars became a thing in the first place. Or they get wrong shows like Book of Boba Fett, another legacy character, or the Kenobi series, which is another one of those really main legacy characters, a fan favorite that obviously fans very much want them or need them to get right. Those are the things they always seem to get wrong, though, and getting them wrong does far, far more damage to your franchise, to your fan base, than screwing something like Skeleton Crew up would have done. I mean, in a parallel universe where the sequels had been pretty much universally loved by all the fans, and Kenobi had been this amazing show, and we had gotten this really badass Book of Boba Fett series, and oh, how I'm jealous of everyone in that timeline. But in that universe, where all the legacy character stuff had been really good, and then maybe Skeleton Crew comes along and it's not so good, and perhaps Rogue One had been a miss as well, and The Mandalorian wasn't that great either. You know, all the things I put on my list as good, pretty much. But in that case, the fans likely are going to be far more forgiving of them for trying something new here and there with new characters and getting it wrong than they are with taking their favorite characters and getting them wrong. But of course, in the opinion of myself and of others as well, that's exactly what they've been doing. The stuff that, for a lack of a better way of putting it, doesn't matter as much, that stuff they seem to get right. And don't get me wrong, it is awesome that Skeleton Crew has been good so far. It's also great that Andor was fantastic. It is hands down one of the best shows I have ever seen, period. No need to put an asterisk next to it or anything that says one of the best shows for Star Wars. It was just amazing all on its own, and it being Star Wars is a cherry on top. And so, to round this out, to go back to the question, what would I recommend if I completely removed any and all of my Star Wars bias and judge it only on how good it is all on its own? Well, again, ironically, it would be the stuff that feels less like Star Wars in some ways, and doesn't deal with the well-known characters or with the Force and the Jedi and Sith and all that go with it. I don't know that I'd recommend any of their truly Star Wars feeling content or that deals with that stuff, because most of that has been bad or average at best. In other words, I don't know that Lucasfilm, here in the Disney era, has managed to make any truly good Star Wars, anything movies and live-action shows anyway, that tries to fully embody everything that makes Star Wars what it is and why it succeeded all those years ago now. They've only managed to make some good shows that are set in the Star Wars galaxy, but tend to be good for non-Star Wars reasons, which is really kind of sad. I mean, I'm happy we have gotten some good Star Wars shows and a good movie, that's great, but I really wish we'd get something that really truly feels like Star Wars, every aspect of it. I wish they could find a way to finally pull something like that off. But until then, I'll take things like Skeleton Crew and Andor, which are, again, very good shows and very good for what they are, but even though there are things about them that very much make them Star Wars, I'm not saying they're not. It would be nice to, again, get something that really just truly is good Star Wars through and through. Some good Jedi versus Sith stuff. Well, I think that's going to be all I got for you this time. Now it is your turn to take to the comments below and tell me if you agree or disagree. Does a Lucasfilm here in the Disney era tend to get the more non-Star Wars things right and the more Star Wars-y things wrong? Or tell me what you would recommend from the Disney era to the more average person who isn't a fan, and would it also be the more non-Star Wars-y stuff, to keep using that term? Or you can also ask a question for a future lightning response video. You start your comment off with "Hey Thor," ask your question, and I'll try to answer it in a future video. But whatever you choose to do, leave a comment below. Let's talk some Star Wars, and until next time, thanks for watching.